Hello and welcome to this edition of Eye on Africa on France 24. I'm Fraser Jackson. Here are the stories making headlines across the continent tonight. A warning alarm is being sounded at the United Nations General Assembly in New York as NGOs tell of a devastating humanitarian crisis. Some estimates say 140 million people in Africa are facing acute food insecurity, with tens of millions on the brink of starvation. Flooding in Nigeria has killed over 300 people so far this year and affected over two-thirds of the country. Authorities say the situation is now beyond their control as the nation faces its worst flooding in a decade. And protesters on the streets of Abidjan in solidarity with 46 soldiers being detained in neighbouring Mali. Ivory Coast says they were there to support aid efforts, but Bamako accuses them of being mercenaries. Let's go to our top story. Mounting food insecurity has been one of the main areas of concern at this year's UN General Assembly. Nowhere is that being felt more than on the African continent, which is especially reliant on cereal exports from Ukraine and Russia. In Somalia, widespread hunger is once again reaching crisis level as the country's worst drought in 4 decades brings it to the brink of its second famine in just 10 years. Brian Quinn has the story.
At this medical center outside Mogadishu, malnourished children are given emergency care. Some of the young patients too weak to even eat. Their mothers often having traveled for days to seek help.
A lack of water has driven us away. To get water, you have to trek for 2 hours, and before you get back, the sun has already set and there is no one to feed the children.
A series of failed rainy seasons since 2020 has sparked Somalia's worst drought in 40 years, decimating crops and livestock. The country now faces the specter of its second famine in just over a decade.
We used to farm and harvest crops to feed our children before the drought. When the rain failed, we moved to Mogadishu, and we're now settled at a makeshift camp not far from here.
This time, international aid has been slow in coming. In the past, the UN has relied on grain shipments from Ukraine and Russia to supply its relief efforts, but Russia's invasion has severely disrupted exports. An estimated 260,000 people died during Somalia's last officially recognized famine in 2011, more than half of them children under the age of 6. The UN says 200,000 Somalians are now in danger of starvation, with 1.5 million children at risk of acute malnutrition by next month.
Well, joining me now is Francesco Rocker. He's the president of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. He's been attending high-level meetings at the UN General Assembly in New York. Mr. Rocker, thank you for joining us tonight here on France 24. Pleasure to have you on the programme. You heard in our report there about food insecurity in Somalia, but let's widen it out a little. How big is the scale of the food crisis, and what impact is the conflict in Ukraine having on food insecurity in Africa?
Look, let me tell you that your service was very precise about numbers and figures, so I won't repeat it. But the situation is really devastating. It is one of the worst crises ever happened in the last 50 years. And the sad aspect that was discussed even this morning at the United Nations is that how we can stop this cycle of starvation that every 5, 6, 7 years we know that it will happen because the weather condition, because the geographical area. So it's something that it's underlining the failure of the international community on giving an answer to too many human beings. And as also you said in the service, sometime when famine is declared, we have yet lost too many thousands or sometimes hundreds of thousands of lives. So it's time to run, but it's also time to switch from being reactionary to this kind of crisis to be anticipatory, because today in the current era we have a lot of tools that can be used to anticipate this kind of crisis. So this is why it's so difficult to be acceptable, and it's so frustrating for the humanitarians and those who are living and experiencing on the ground this crisis.
Well, just for our viewers, what other factors are contributing to the hunger crisis that's been seen across the continent?
across the continent, there are around 22 countries that are affected at the moment. But our concern is mainly in the Horn of Africa. This is Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya are really experiencing something unprecedented.
Well, let's touch on that. Ethiopia. People will remember the shocking images of the famine there almost 40 years ago now, when over 400,000 people died. The UN estimates that was actually around 1 million people died during that famine. How far away are we from seeing similar images now?
It's very close. So the answer is very simple, and it's not to be rhetorical. This is something concrete, and we are going to be very, very close to experience again what happened in 1984, but without the same mobilization. And look, I want to tell you something. Why also is so frustrating. We have seen when there is a political will to fix humanitarian crisis, like the massive influx of refugees in Europe after the crisis in Ukraine started. Told us that with the political will, it's possible to give concrete answer. So we hope that even for these human beings in Africa, we can give the same answer.
Well, let's touch upon that political will. Your organization says over 140 million people are facing acute food insecurity, as I said. Well, today, Joe Biden at the UNGA announced almost $3 billion to tackle the problem globally. But what else do you want to see? What else do you want to see? Do you want to see being done?
No, it's of course this is it's a good news, and I hope we will be followed by other countries to show the same goodwill. What we want is just that this money will arrive and will be strategized by the local actors. In too many occasions in the past years, this is another lesson learned. We thought that from outside we can teach how to cope with this kind of crisis. It must be this time exactly the opposite. The local actors, those who are living on the ground, they know the needs. They know how to reach the most vulnerable, the hidden ones, and this is extremely important. Just to give you an example, in Somalia, our teams of the Somali Red Crescent are working with the nomadic communities, so that we know always where we can deliver. It's not anymore an issue to where we can deliver. Unfortunately, it's what we can deliver. This has become an issue.
An immediate rush of money is not likely to solve the problem, though, is it? What kind of longer-term solutions do you want to see being implemented?
More dialogue. I think the most important thing is to open the dialogue not only among the states, but all the sectors. And humanitarians are not alone, cannot fix these situations. We need the involvement of the private sector. We need the involvement of the governments. This must be. We must bridge, as we used to say, the silos. This is vital to fix once for all this issue and stop and revert these cycles of disasters.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that, Francesco Rocker, the president of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies in New York. Thank you for joining us here on France 24.
Thank you.
Moving on, authorities in Nigeria say the flooding situation in the country is, quote, beyond our control. Over 300 people have been killed this year by the worst flooding seen in a decade. Over 2/3 of Nigeria's states have been impacted, with over 100,000 displaced. For more, here's our correspondent in Lagos, Sam Olukoya.
300 people have died in Nigeria in the last 2 months as the country suffers its worst flooding in decades. Large expanses of farmlands have been lost to floods. This has further aggravated the food crisis in places like northeast Nigeria, where jihadist-induced conflicts have already caused food shortages. Recent flooding have also affected neighbouring Niger Republic, which is also impacted by jihadist insurgency. The international crisis group Save the Children says children make up about half of those affected by the floods in Nigeria and Niger. Authorities warn that the situation could get worse with more heavy rains expected in the coming days. Besides, water released from a dam in neighboring Cameroon have started inundating communities that are already flooded. Some of Nigeria's largest dams have also started spilling excess water from their reservoirs. Authorities are treating the situation as an emergency. People in flood-prone areas have been asked to move to high grounds and stockpile food and other essential items to serve them during periods of possible displacement. Emergency staff on leave have been recalled in view of the environmental crisis.
A key player in Tunisian politics has been released after he was questioned overnight by anti-terror police. The 81-year-old head of the Ennahda opposition party, Rached Ghannouchi, was interrogated about complicity in the departure of jihadist militants for Syria and Iraq. Ghannouchi has denied the allegations, but his lawyer said another hearing is scheduled for the end of November. His release came hours after his fellow party member and former Prime Minister Ali Lareed was also questioned in a move the Ennahda party called a political attack. And finally, hundreds of people marched through Ivory Coast port city of Abidjan on Tuesday in solidarity with 46 soldiers who've been detained by neighbour Mali since July. Regional trading bloc ECOWAS is trying to diffuse tensions between the two countries, with meetings being held on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. Lauren Berstecker has more.
Marching in the streets of Abidjan, hundreds of protesters called for the immediate release of the 46 Ivorian soldiers still detained in Mali.
It cannot go on like this. They must free those children. They are just soldiers. They aren't criminals. They have nothing to do with Malian politics.
In early July, 49 Ivorian soldiers were arrested at the Bamako airport and were accused by Mali of being mercenaries sent to destabilize the country. The accusations were rejected by Ivorian authorities, who said the soldiers were part of a UN contingent. The United Nations later backed this claim, but admitted to procedural errors in sending the peacekeeping troops to Mali. Earlier this month, Bamako agreed to free 3 of the detained soldiers, but a few days later, the country's military government said the release of the 46 remaining troops would be conditional on the extradition of several Malian nationals living in Ivory Coast. Ivorian authorities denounced an unacceptable blackmail attempt and called on ECOWAS to mediate the dispute. The West African organization is set to hold an extraordinary summit in New York on Thursday, a meeting where the issue of the jailed Ivorian soldiers is likely to take center stage.
Well, that's it for this edition. Stay tuned to France 24.
July 1942 saw the largest mass arrest of Jews in France, in central Paris, the Vélodrome d'Hiver roundup.
Les gens faisaient la queue sans dire un mot, comme des animaux à l'abattoir.
Thanks to the accounts of survivors, we revisit the story of the deported families who fought to survive during the darkest hours of France's history.
Je ne vais pas te quitter, j'ai hurlé. Elle m'a giflé violemment, la seule gifle de ma vie. Mais c'est plus tard que j'ai compris que cette gifle m'a sauvé la vie.
Watch Revisited, the roundup of Jews in Paris on France 24 and France24.com.